All right, we're ready for our main talk. I would like to introduce Eli. He's a staff engineer from Brighton, Michigan, and he has over a decade experience working with Python. And I'm so excited he's bringing all that knowledge to Michigan Python this evening. In his day job, he works at Notable.io. And so, yeah, welcome, Eli. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So today we're going to be building a ChatGPT plugin using Python that actually executes Python. And so a little bit about myself. Oops, here we go. Before we dive in. So like Dan mentioned, I'm Eli, staff engineer and tech lead at Notable. Lots of personal or side projects going on. I live in Brighton. Grew up in Michigan pretty much my whole life. I lived in California for a couple of years, worked at a few startups there. Also lived in France for a bit. I don't speak any French anymore, so don't try to speak that with me anymore. But yeah, let's get into it. So ChatGPT, if you're not familiar with it, ChatGPT is a large language model. And what that means is that it's been trained on billions and billions of parameters. And those parameters come from different sources of text. So those could be books, they could be websites, they could be blogs, really a whole variety of different things. And ChatGPT is built by a company called OpenAI. If you're not familiar with it, Elon Musk is one of the investors. It was co-founded by Sam, I forget his last name, Sam A something. And to give you a little context on the size of this model, ChatGPT 3 required about a terabyte of RAM to train. And that was the slower, less knowledgeable version. So we're up to ChatGPT 4 now, which is even larger. And my guess is it required even more RAM and CPU to train. And something they added recently was plugin support. So previously, when you were talking with ChatGPT, it could only use the knowledge and the data that it's been trained up to. And currently that's about September 2021. So if you want any data that's newer than that, it doesn't have direct access to that. So through plugins, we're giving ChatGPT the access to interact with our APIs, with our applications, and get the most recent data, or do more interesting things like execute code. And so here's a few examples of ChatGPT plugins. The first ones were like Wolfram Alpha, Instacart, OpenTable, Zillow, Redfin, Kayak. And the company I work for, Notable, has recently released our own plugin as well. So let's talk a little bit about the plugin that we're going to be building today. I'm not going to go through like live writing the code, but you'll see the important pieces of code and actually see a live demo of this working if, fingers crossed, everything works well. So you can see on the right side here, we're interacting with ChatGPT in the normal conversational way. We're saying, please read the CSV using pandas and generate a violin chart showing fares by class. And so what our plugin is going to do is take the input from ChatGPT. ChatGPT is going to generate some Python code using pandas, and then read that CSV, and then use some sort of charting library, maybe Plotly or Matplotlib, to generate this violin chart. So before we dive into the code piece and seeing this working live in action, let's talk about a little bit at a high level what actually goes into a plugin. And from my point of view, there's two important pieces. The first piece is the authentication server. So this could be the same server that you're currently running your API on, or it could be something different. For our example, we're going to be using Auth0, which is a free authentication service, and it makes this a little bit easier. The second piece is the plugin server itself. So this is where you will host two important endpoints. The first one is called the AI plugin.json. This tells ChatGPT, this is how authentication works. We're using OAuth. These are my configured endpoints for authentication. And then the other one is our OpenAPI specification. So this tells ChatGPT, these are the available endpoints that you can use, and here's the input data types and the expected output data types. So going back to our plugin now, what is this going to look like? So as a user, I'd go to ChatGPT and say, hey, help me write a notebook to analyze this data. What ChatGPT will do is it will look at your query and figure out, okay, I could use Python for this. I can use this Jupyter plugin because I know it can execute code, and these are the available endpoints. So once ChatGPT determines the different API calls to make, it'll actually start hitting our FastAPI web server. Once it gets to FastAPI, we're going to use some of the internals of Jupyter. If you used Jupyter before, it's a way that you can write Python code in a notebook type interface. So you can intermix Python code with Markdown and run it on your local machine, or possibly remotely too. Let's talk about the AI plugin.json for a little bit, because this is the main entry point that ChatGPT is going to use to discover your plugin. And I want to call out three important things here. So we have a lot of metadata going on here. The first section that I want to call out is the API. So here we define where ChatGPT is going to get our API information from. We've defined it as open API specification, and this is the URL that it can fetch it from. The next part is the authentication section. So you could do this without any auth, but I wanted to show how OAuth works with the ChatGPT plugin, because it is not very straightforward at all. And so these different values that we're configuring here are going to allow ChatGPT, when a user installs your plugin, they will log into your website, be redirected back to ChatGPT, and then ChatGPT will interact with your API on behalf of that user. And we'll see a little bit more how that works in a little bit here. Speaking of, let's make it in FastAPI. Before that, were there any questions so far, Dan?
No questions in chat so far.
Sounds good. All right, so I'm going to hop over to VS Code here. And I'm going to go through, I'm not going to write the code live because that would take too long, but I'll highlight the important bits of code here. So I'm using Poetry to manage my Python project here. So if you haven't seen a pyproject.toml before, it's kind of the new or newer setup.py for managing and building Python applications. Over here, I have my root module called Jupyter. Then I have a few folders here. I have my routes. This will contain all the FastAPI code. Static, I just have our logo here, so ChatGPT can display that. And then I have a template, which I'll get into in a little bit. So let's talk about FastAPI first. If you're not familiar with FastAPI, FastAPI allows you to build an asynchronous web application. And by default, you can configure it to do pretty much anything you'd like. So here in the setup here, we're defining the open API URL, which is very important for ChatGPT to use, as well as the servers. So these things don't come configured automatically by FastAPI, but for ChatGPT, we really need to configure these. Otherwise, it's not going to know how to use our application. We're also adding some middleware for security. So if you're not familiar with CORS, that's okay. This middleware just says that the only website that should be allowed to call this API is chat.openai.com and localhost if we're running it there. Then we mount some static files so that we can show our logo to ChatGPT, and then we include a bunch of routers. So these routers are ways that we can organize our code to, as our code base grows, we might have authentication, we'll have API routes, we might have some internal routes that we might want to keep separate. And so routers allow us to separate all that logic. Another way to think about them is you can kind of think of them with prefixes, and that's kind of an easier way for me to think about them too. So our root router doesn't have any prefix, so that will start at the root, which is just slash. And then our API routes will start at /API, something there. And then our OAuth routes same idea. Cool. So let's take a look at the first set of routes that we have here. So these are the root level routes, and they don't really have a other place to live besides the root. And so, like I mentioned before, the AI plugin.json, this is the main entry point that ChatGPT is going to use to find all of our configuration values. And for this, I'm actually using YAML because it's a little bit easier to read and work with than JSON directly. I'll come back to why you don't want to use YAML in the future, but I'll get back to that. The next part, if I go back to root, is images. So like I showed in the slides earlier, ChatGPT is actually being able to display the chart that our Python code generated. And in order to do that, we need to expose a URL where ChatGPT can fetch that image from. And then a robots.txt, which isn't really important in our case. So let's talk about the API next. When you're building a ChatGPT plugin, in my experience, which is not very long, but in our experience so far, keeping the number of API endpoints limited really helps ChatGPT determine which endpoint it should use and what data it should be sending to your application. So in this case, I've only defined 2 endpoints here. The first one is going to start a kernel. Starting a kernel, this is going to be our runtime environment for executing Python code. So you can think of, for each chat that a user has, they will have a separate kernel instance. So each chat will be completely separate and have its execution isolated from the other chats that you might be running. And then we have the run cell endpoint. So here we're taking some input. We have the kernel ID. This is actually optional because I found that ChatGPT really wants to make only one request if it can. And then we have code. So this is the code that ChatGPT wants to actually execute. So we do a little bit of validation logic here. Like I mentioned, kernel ID is optional. So if it's not specified, we'll start that automatically, and then we will run the code. I want to talk a little bit about how the code is running because I think it's kind of interesting. So if you've used Jupyter notebooks before, you might not be aware that there's actually a Python interface to working with Jupyter notebooks. And that package is called Jupyter Client, which is conveniently named. And so it exposes some interfaces like this multi-kernel manager, which allows us to start multiple kernels. And then we have the kernel manager itself. Jupyter is by far one of the most complex packages I've ever used. And so at Notable, we've open sourced a library called kernel sidecar, which makes it significantly easier to interact with Jupyter. And so what kernel sidecar does, I'll go down to run cell here. Let's assume that we already have a kernel running. We're going to get the sidecar client. You can think of the sidecar client as a way to execute code with a Jupyter kernel. We define a few handlers, and handlers are a way for us to say, when I get some output from the kernel, I want to handle it this way, or when I get some sort of status update, I want to handle it a different way. And in our case, we actually want to merge those two together so we can give ChatGPT a reasonable response. And then once we have that, we send an execute request, which means I want to execute this piece of code. We pass in the code and the handlers, and we're doing some cool stuff under the hood that says, wait until this request finishes, but don't block the application. So if this were a synchronous blocking application, FastAPI would be totally blocked. It wouldn't be able to serve any requests until this execution finish. So by using async IO and the await keyword here, we're saying, okay, FastAPI, you can serve other requests. You can do your thing while this code is executing. So after the execution finishes, we kind of merge the results of the output and the status. And I'll scroll down here so you can see what that looks like. It might be a little strange to read, but the gist of it is that when a user executes a piece of code, we might get or we might get output from various different sources. We might get it from standard out. We might get it from standard error. Jupyter also has a concept of display data. So, well, display data as well as execute result content, which I won't get into the details of those. Happy to talk about it later, but it's some sort of output that you're putting to the screen. And so we want to send all this output back to ChatGPT. And then the status handler, if I go down here, all we really care about is, did this execution succeed or did it fail? And so we combine both of those responses here. We pass in the status, the kernel ID, and here we're formatting basically all the output so that ChatGPT can interpret that. The cool part here is this image store. So what this image store is doing is it's looking at all that output content and seeing, okay, were there some charts that were generated? Were there some images that were displayed? And if we don't store this data somewhere else, ChatGPT doesn't have a way to display it. So I'll show you a little bit more how this works later on. But for the meantime, you can think of image store as stashing those bytes away for future use. Okay, it's a lot. I don't expect you to understand all of this, but we're moving on to authentication. So like I mentioned before, we're going to be using Auth0 to handle the authentication side of things. Auth0 actually provides URLs that we can use directly, but they don't quite work with ChatGPT directly. I won't go too far into detail here. If you're interested in how OAuth works with ChatGPT, I put a little longer markdown document here of how that works. And then I also made a Auth0 doc here of how you should set up your account if you want to try it out. Okay, phew, that was a lot. Let's maybe try it out. I don't know. Does anyone want to see a demo of this?
Yeah, let's check it out.
Cool. Okay. So let's hop over here. Well, if I go back here, so I'm using ngrok here to forward a plugin to my local host. I'll start up the server here. I also put this in here because it is going to be executing code on my computer, so it is a little risky. All right, so if we go back over here now, we'll hop into the plugin store, develop our own plugin, type in the URL, find manifest. All right, I got some errors here. Ah, right. Okay, so if I go back over here, it should be some there. Let's try it again. All right, so yeah, the issue that it's saying here is that the URL that's being defined here does not match the URL that we provided. And so I'm not quite sure why that's not working. For now, I'm just going to copy this over to our settings up here. Actually, that's weird. I don't know what it says. Oh. All right, let's try pasting it in here and see if that works. Nope, still doesn't like that for some reason. Well, this was working about an hour ago. Let's see if I have any things. Aha, okay. Let's unset domain. Okay, this should work right now. Hey, there we go. Great. Okay, so it reached out and it fetched our manifest. This is what we defined in JSON. It fetched some metadata showing our logo here. Now what I need to do is, since we're using OAuth, I'm going to configure a few of the parameters here. And again, if you want to know more about how it works with OAuth, I'd recommend taking a look at that doc that I mentioned, or happy to answer questions later on. Okay, cool. So it saved those. Now what we need to do is copy this verification token. We'll go back to our .env, update this here, reload our web server. And so this verification token is basically just a way that ChatGPT says, okay, you're who you said you were. Click verify, everything looks good. Cool. So now we can install it for myself, and we'll go to login. Okay, sometimes this happens, and I think it's a bug with ChatGPT. So for some reason it says, hey, I saved your config, but not really. So we're just going to have to go through this again real quick. Either that or they're having some downtime right now, which would be unfortunate. All right, one more time. You can do a ChatGPT. Okay, there we go. Let's start in again. Okay, copy this over. Cool. Yeah, so it works this time. I don't know why the first time it doesn't work occasionally. Okay, cool. So now we have our plugin enabled here. So I will show a quick example. So this is going to be the Titanic example that I showed earlier. Since ChatGPT is generative, we might get something completely different this time, but let's see what happens. So right now it's thinking. So you can see this plugin pop up here. So the first request it sent, if we hover over here, is say it's creating the kernel. I actually haven't seen that before. Usually it skips to the second request here. Yep, so we can see that it tried to run this code. It says, oops, pandas is not found. And yeah, sometimes it does this where it'll give you the code here instead. So to fix that, oh, actually, is it gonna, no, okay. So if I go back over here, we can do a quick install pandas. Sometimes ChatGPT will retry it and it'll execute the first cell as installing pandas, but decided not to this time for some reason. Okay, cool. So we have those all up to date. Let's run our web server again. Cool. Okay, so we're just gonna try this same thing again. You can see what it's running. Cool, it started up a kernel. We can see the code that it's generating here. So it's using pandas to read in the CSV file, and then it's going to show the head. Oh, still doesn't think pandas exists. Huh. Well, that is odd. Okay, let's try coaxing it along first. Let's say, please install pandas first. Okay, cool. So it's gonna execute this code. It's taking a little while to run because it's executing in this Jupyter notebook right now. Once it's finished, we'll actually be able to see the output. For the pip install, it's not going to be very interesting because it's just a bunch of progress bars. But it should come through in a little while here. Nope, didn't like that. Okay, well, that's unfortunate. This was working. Not sure why it's not wanting to install pandas this time. Let's give it one more shot here. Let's see which Jupyter and which Python. Right. So my guess is what's happening is that it's using the wrong Python environment. So let me try running it from a terminal instead. Should be activating. Okay. Well, let's try it again and see what happens. If it doesn't work, you'll have to believe me that it worked before.
It's only because you have an audience now.
Yeah, that's how it always is. All right, let's see what it's doing. So we're starting up the kernel again. Maybe. Yeah, I don't see a request coming through there. Well, not quite sure what's going on here. It might be something on ChatGPT's end. Could be something with my configuration. Hard to say what's going on right now. So sorry about that. I'll go back to the example further up here. This definitely did work before. So we're able to, send the same prompt through here, and then it was able to give us a nice violin chart here. And if it starts working tomorrow, maybe I'll record a video and post it in Discord. So yeah, we went through that. We talked about auth 0 secrets. Talked about that. Didn't really work trying it out. Okay, so if this would have worked, we would have a working ChatGPT plugin, and we could maybe publish it for other people to use. But before we do that, I think it's worth taking a minute to talk about ethics in AI, especially for ChatGPT plugins, which are becoming much more widespread and available for anyone to develop. So in our case, we need to think about a few different things. First and foremost, user privacy and data misuse come to mind for me. So users are going to be sending us information to execute code. That code execution, at least right now, is going to be running on my computer, which is a pretty big security issue, and we don't want to do that in production. The data that users are sending to us also might contain some sensitive information that we don't want ending up in our logs or downstream to like Google Analytics or other providers like that. So we need to be sure that the data that's coming into us from ChatGPT is handled in a secure way that takes into account users' privacy. The second part that I want to talk about is just ChatGPT usage in general, like ethically. There's schools and companies who have actually been banning ChatGPT because like students have been cheating on exams, they've been writing essays with it. And then from a company point of view, employees have been sharing confidential proprietary information on ChatGPT, and they don't realize that that data that they're sharing or talking to the AI model with is actually going to be used for future training. So with the next generation of ChatGPT, when you click the little, plus or thumbs up icon, you're actually training or helping to train the model that, okay, this was a good response. You should use something like this in the future. And then the last thing to talk about is security. So like I mentioned, this the plugin that I tried to show is executing code on my computer. And that's not great, because if I were to share this link with all of you and you were to try it out, you could execute really whatever you want on my computer. So you could install malware, you could install some backdoors, you could really do whatever you wanted. Don't worry, I took that into consideration. You won't be able to sign up if you try it. With that being said, if we did want to have a plugin that did code execution in a secure way, the company that I work for, Notable, we've built a plugin that does just that. So it works very similarly to the plugin that I demoed or tried to demo here. It runs Jupyter notebooks, it executes code, you get the results back in ChatGPT. And the benefit of using like a more advanced plugin like this is that we can actually see the code being executed in the notebook in the Notable platform. So if you're interested, you can check out the YouTube video here or go to app.notable.io to get started. I think it also is showing up here. I start a new chat. If we go to plugins, plugin store, maybe see if it loads. Okay, maybe it's OpenAI that's having the issue or not tonight. Okay, well, again, theoretically, it would have shown up there, but that's all right. That's pretty much it. Sorry, the demo didn't work exactly as planned. Here's a link to the code that I was showing. There's some documentation in there full of markdown files if you want to go more in depth with OAuth or Auth0. You can follow me on Mastodon if you're interested. Happy to answer questions there or after this. And then if you want to try out the Notable plugin, there's a link to that as well. So yeah, happy to answer any questions now, or yeah.
We had one question in chat, and Verm asks, have you tried any other AIs?
Yes. So, well, other AI APIs? No. Other AIs? Yes. So the Bard from Google is pretty decent. They released this a little while after ChatGPT, and so it's not quite as powerful yet. But with Google I/O recently, they've made it quite a bit more powerful. So here you have kind of the similar interface where you can talk to it in like a chat type way, where you can ask it questions and it'll reply to you. But they also released something recently. I don't know if it'll show up for me. I think it's only on Google Chrome that it'll show up. But if you're doing like a Google search, your Google search is like, how do I use pandas? It would actually show you the code there, rather than giving you like links to Stack Overflow and stuff like that.
Any other questions for Eli, anyone?
Thank you for your time, Eli. What do you think about decentralized AI?
I'm gonna have to hold my tongue a little bit. Sorry. I did a little exploration in the Web3 space, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. Decentralized AI, I don't really have an understanding of, to be honest. So,
Okay.
Yeah, not quite sure.
In the chat, I dropped a link to a YouTube video. Ash Bennington, I think his name was, interviewed Const, the co-founder of BitTensor, which is a decentralized AI combined with blockchain compute power, but it's a mixtures of experts model. So all the AI is connected. So the idea is to learn that much faster, eventually just then the silo of information you're giving it, and then it feeds off of. But yeah, definitely check it out. It might be an interesting watch.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for Eli? Anyone? All right, thanks so much, Eli, for coming in and giving that talk about ChatGPT and how to build it with FastAPI and kind of all the Python tools. That was a lot of fun. So thanks so much.
Yeah, happy to do it.